"Take it off," Judge Richard Whitmore said, his voice slicing through the stale courtroom air with the cold certainty of a man unused to being challenged. "This court has no place for costume jewelry." A ripple moved through courtroom 3B, subtle as wind over dry grass, then died into silence. At the defense table, Martin Hale did not move. 87 years old, shoulders bent by time but not surrender. He sat in a plain wool coat with a faded blue ribbon resting against his chest, the small metal catching a hard flicker from fluorescent lights overhead. It looked modest, almost ordinary, until one noticed the way his hand rested near it. Not possessive, not defensive, simply familiar, as though the metal had become part of bone. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, irritation sharpening his features. His black robe rustled against polished oak as he pointed. "I will not ask again. Remove that trinket before I hold you in contempt." The word hung there. Trinket carried a sneer larger than itself. Somewhere near the back, a woman drew in breath through her teeth. A bailiff shifted his boots against marble tile. But Martin Hale only lifted his pale blue eyes toward the bench, calm as winter water, and in that stillness there was something ancient enough to make the room uneasy. The charge against him was absurdly small, a zoning citation over a weathered flagpole on property he had owned since Eisenhower, but somehow the morning had curdled into something harsher. Assistant Prosecutor Ethan Cole, seated 2 tables away, felt it too. 29 years old, Harvard Law, eager and careful. He had spent the hearing half distracted by paperwork until the old veteran's silence pulled at him like gravity. He studied the ribbon. Something about the shade of blue troubled his memory. The judge mistook silence for submission. "Bailiff," Whitmore snapped. "Assist the defendant if necessary." Heavy footsteps crossed the polished floor. Leather creaked. The bailiff stopped beside Martin, towering over him, but hesitated. Because the old man was not afraid. Because there was a strange authority in his stillness. Because even before anyone understood why, the room sensed a boundary. No one should cross. "Sir," the bailiff said quietly, almost apologetic. "Please." Martin's fingers rose, weathered and deliberate, touching the edge of the ribbon. For the briefest instant his gaze drifted beyond the courtroom walls, somewhere none of them could follow. The fluorescent hum faded under another remembered sound, a phantom rotor thrum hidden in silence. Then he spoke, voice rough but steady. "This metal stays where it was placed. Not loud, not defiant, just final." A pulse of tension ran through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore's face reddened. "You presume this relic gives you immunity?" he barked. "In my courtroom, respect is earned." Ethan Cole felt something cold move through him, because he knew suddenly what ribbon he was looking at, and because the judge, in his arrogance, had just stepped onto sacred ground. Ethan's hand slid under the table toward his phone as Whitmore rose halfway from the bench, preparing to make an example of the old man. Outside, beyond thick courthouse windows, rain whispered over granite steps. Far off, tires hissed on wet pavement. And though no one inside yet knew it, something had already begun moving toward the courthouse with the force of old promises being awakened. Ethan Cole kept his face lowered as if studying notes, but his pulse had begun to pound in his ears. The pale blue ribbon would not leave his mind. He had seen it once as a boy in a glass case at West Point when his father, a colonel with a rigid sense of honor, stood silent before it longer than before any battle map. There were not many living men who wore that ribbon. And now a county judge had called it a trinket. Across the courtroom, Judge Whitmore mistook the growing silence for victory. He adjusted his robe and looked down with that brittle confidence authority sometimes wears when it cannot sense danger. "Last warning, Mr. Hale." His gavel tapped once, hard as a rifle crack. Martin Hale did not answer. His hand remained on the metal, thumb moving almost imperceptibly along worn metal edges polished smooth by decades. His eyes drifted not toward the judge but toward the courtroom flag in the corner, and for a heartbeat he seemed to be listening to something far older than the room. Ethan rose quietly, murmured an excuse to a clerk, and stepped into the corridor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled faintly of rain tracked in from the marble steps. His hands shook as he dialed a number saved years ago and never used. Colonel David Mercer answered on the second ring with the clipped precision of a man who did not waste syllables. Ethan spoke low and fast. He gave the name, Martin Hale. Then he described the ribbon. Silence answered him first. Not confusion. Shock. Ethan heard movement on the other end. A chair scraping back, papers shoved aside. "Stay where you are," Mercer said, voice transformed into chilled steel. "Do not let that courtroom clear." The line went dead. Ethan stood frozen, aware he had thrown a stone into very deep water. Back inside, proceedings had grown stranger. Even the judge seemed to feel it now, though pride kept him moving forward. The bailiff had stepped back from Martin as if instinct overruled instruction. A woman in the gallery clutched her purse against her chest. No one whispered anymore. The whole room had taken on the pressure of storm air before thunder. Judge Whitmore resumed, but his voice had lost some edge. "You leave me no choice." He began citing contempt statutes, each word sounding smaller than the last against the weight gathering unseen. Martin listened without expression. Yet inside him another room had opened, one lined with jungle heat and rotor wash, and a younger general fastening a ribbon while saying a nation could forget many things but should never forget its defenders. That promise echoed now against courthouse walls. Outside, rain strengthened, silver streams running down broad windows. 2 blocks away, black sedans turned onto Main Street. Tires whispered over wet asphalt. At the Pentagon Annex, Colonel Mercer had already entered an office without knocking. A framed photograph on a wall stopped him for half a second, showing a young soldier beside a weathered sergeant with pale blue eyes. Martin Hale, living legend. The colonel spoke only one sentence before a 3-star general stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. In the courtroom, Judge Whitmore lifted the gavel to set sentencing in motion. But Ethan, returning through the side door, saw something through rain-streaked glass that made breath catch in his throat. Dark vehicles pulling hard against the curb. Uniformed figures stepping into weather. And he understood the avalanche had arrived. The gavel never struck. Before Judge Whitmore could bring it down, the rear doors opened with a heavy wooden groan that rolled through the courtroom like distant thunder. Every head turned. Rain-cooled air slipped inside carrying the scent of wet pavement and old stone. And framed in the doorway stood 2 military police in dress uniform, motionless for one breath, then stepping aside. Behind them entered General Thomas Cade. 3 stars gleamed beneath courthouse lights. His dress blues seemed almost too severe for the drab room, each ribbon precise, every movement measured. But it was not rank that changed the air. It was recognition. The judge rose halfway, confused, pride warring with instinct. "This is highly irregular," he began, but the words fell flat. General Cade did not look at him. His eyes had fixed on Martin Hale. For a second the old veteran remained seated, hands folded over the metal, expression unreadable. Then something passed between the 2 men beyond speech, some old language of service and memory. Cade moved forward alone, polished shoes sounding against marble in slow, deliberate cadence. Even the bailiff stepped back. Ethan Cole felt the room hold its breath. Judge Whitmore tried again. "General, these proceedings are suspended," Cade said without raising his voice. The calm in it carried more force than anger could have. He stopped before Martin Hale and, to the astonishment of everyone present, came to rigid attention. The sharp sound of his heels meeting the floor echoed against paneled walls. Then he lifted his hand in salute. No one moved. No one seemed able. The woman in the gallery pressed fingers to her mouth. The clerk stood frozen, pen hanging above paper. Even the rain against windows sounded distant. Martin looked up slowly, and in his pale eyes there flickered the ghost of a younger battlefield. He returned the salute with the restrained ease of habit older than most people in the room. Only then did General Cade turn toward the bench. "Judge Whitmore," he said, "the decoration you called a trinket was placed on this man by a President of the United States for valor under impossible conditions." The judge's face had drained of color. "I was unaware." That is precisely the problem. Cade did not thunder. He did not need to. His words fell with quiet finality. Honor does not diminish because a courtroom fails to recognize it. Behind him more uniformed officers entered, among them Colonel Mercer, and with them an honor guard whose presence transformed the chamber into something closer to sacred ground. Ethan realized no one had arranged this as theater. This was reflex, an institution rising to defend one of its own. Martin Hale, who had sat through insult without protest, seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. He touched the medal again, not as symbol now but memory. Cade lowered his voice and addressed him alone. "Sir, we should have come sooner." Martin gave the faintest smile. "You got here in time." On the bench, Whitmore remained standing though no one had ordered it. His hand resting uselessly on the gavel he no longer controlled. Outside, more vehicles lined the curb, red brake lights glowing through rain. Inside, the courtroom had become very still, not with fear but reverence. And Ethan Cole understood this was not the climax he had expected. This was only the moment the balance began to reverse. General Cade did not lower his salute until Martin Hale's hand fell back to the worn blue ribbon. The silence that followed carried a strange gravity, as if the courtroom itself had shifted allegiance. Judge Whitmore opened his mouth once, then closed it, his authority reduced to a brittle shell beneath fluorescent lights. Cade turned slightly and nodded to Colonel Mercer, who stepped forward carrying a slim, weathered folder, edges softened by age. "With the court's permission," Mercer said, though it sounded less like a request than ceremony, "there is context that should be entered into the record." No one objected. No one dared. Mercer opened the file and a sepia photograph slid into view. A young sergeant in mud-stained fatigues beside a helicopter, face lean, eyes unmistakable. Martin glanced at it, and for the first time something moved across his features beyond stillness. Memory. Outside, rain tapped steady against the windows, but inside another weather had begun. Mercer read from a faded citation, his voice measured. "For extraordinary courage under sustained fire while evacuating wounded personnel." The words dissolved from Martin into older sounds, rotor blades beating heavy tropical air, wet jungle heat pressing against skin, radio static hissing through chaos. He was 23 again, kneeling in red clay beside wounded men, hearing a young lieutenant whisper through blood and fear that no one was getting out. Then the engine failed. Then smoke. Then a hand shoved tools at him and he crawled toward an open panel while others prayed. The memory came not as spectacle but fragments sharpened by age. Rainwater running off steel, a torn glove, the metallic taste of fear swallowed and ignored. In the courtroom, no one moved as Mercer continued. Sergeant Martin Hale restored flight capability under impossible field conditions, enabling extraction of 17 personnel. Ethan Cole watched jurors from another case drifting to the doorway, drawn by the unnatural stillness. Even the clerk had forgotten to type. General Cade let the citation settle before speaking. The medal Judge Whitmore questioned was awarded for saving lives when every condition argued surrender. His gaze swept the room. Some things are sacred whether recognized or not. Judge Whitmore gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles paled. "General, had I known." Cade stopped him with a look, not harsh but absolute. "Respect is not meant to depend on prior knowledge." Martin finally spoke, voice almost gentle. "Let it rest, General." That startled Ethan most. The old veteran did not want vengeance. He wanted dignity restored and no more. Yet the reversal deepened. The bailiff, moved by instinct older than protocol, stepped beside Martin and pulled out a chair as if guarding a head of state. In the gallery, a veteran, in a feed store cap, slowly rose and placed his hand over his heart. Others followed without being asked. A quiet chain reaction of reverence. Mercer removed a second item from the folder, a folded letter yellowed by decades. "From President Wallace," he said softly. Even Cade seemed to stand straighter. As Mercer read a line about uncommon duty and enduring honor, Martin's thumb brushed the metal again and the old flashback dissolved, leaving only the weight of promises carried too long alone. Judge Whitmore looked suddenly smaller, not defeated by humiliation but confronted by measure. And Ethan sensed the true reckoning was no longer about a contempt charge or a judge's arrogance. It had become about whether a nation remembered the people who bore its burdens. Then Cade turned toward the bench once more, and in his eyes was the calm of a man about to ask for something far greater than an apology. General Cade let the silence hold until every eye in the courtroom had settled, not on rank or robes, but on Martin Hale. Then he spoke with the restrained precision of a man accustomed to command carrying moral weight. "Your Honor," he said, "I am requesting this court correct the record." Judge Whitmore swallowed hard. The arrogance that had filled his voice an hour earlier had drained into something closer to exposure. "What correction do you seek?" Cade's answer came almost softly. "Begin with the recognition that this defendant entered this room not as a nuisance to be disciplined, but as a decorated soldier owed the presumption of dignity." The words settled over polished oak and marble like judgment of another kind. Ethan Cole felt them strike deeper than any objection he had raised in law school simulations. This was not legal maneuver. It was moral geometry resetting itself. Judge Whitmore looked down at Martin Hale for what felt like the first time rather than through him. The old veteran sat unchanged, still composed, still carrying none of the triumph others might have savored. That restraint seemed to weigh heavier than accusation. The judge removed his glasses, an unconscious gesture of a man suddenly stripped of defenses. "Mr. Hale," he said, voice roughened, "this court owes you an apology." A murmur moved through the gallery, not theatrical, but the sound people make when witnessing something rare enough to restore faith. Martin lifted his eyes. "Respect does not belong to me alone, Judge," he said. "It belongs to what the medal stands for." Even General Cade gave the slightest nod, as though hearing a principle older than both institutions represented in the room. Colonel Mercer stepped forward once more and placed the yellowed presidential letter before the bench. Judge Whitmore read silently, lips tightening at a passage handwritten decades before. Courage is often carried by the quietest men. The judge looked up altered. Not absolved, but altered. He set aside the contempt motion, dismissed the citation entirely, then did something no one expected. He rose from the bench and stepped down onto the courtroom floor. Gasps flickered around the room. Judges did not do that. Not here. Not for this. He approached Martin slowly, robe brushing marble, and stopped within arm's length. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the medal. Martin gave one small nod. Whitmore did not touch it. He simply bowed his head for a moment before stepping back. No speech could have equaled that. In the gallery, the old veteran in the feed store cap stood straighter and whispered, "About time." A few people smiled through wet eyes. Even the bailiff, broad and stoic, cleared his throat as if emotion were an unwelcome but unavoidable guest. Outside, rain had begun to ease. Light filtered pale through clouds, washing courthouse windows in silver. General Cade turned toward Martin. "Sir, there is a motorcade outside if you will permit us to escort you home." Martin's mouth curved with faint amusement. "I drove myself." Soft laughter moved through the room, releasing tension at last. But before the moment could drift into comfort, Ethan noticed a folded paper in Mercer's file stamped with a seal older than any citation. Cade noticed his glance and said quietly, almost to himself, "He still does not know." Ethan frowned. "Know what, sir?" The general looked toward Martin Hale, eyes carrying something almost reverent. "There is a final order signed 40 years ago that was never delivered." The room had already witnessed reversal, apology, and honor restored. Yet as Mercer unfolded that final document, Ethan sensed the deepest revelation had been waiting until now. Colonel Mercer held the folded document with both hands as if it carried more weight than paper should. The courtroom, moments ago softened by apology and uneasy laughter, grew still again. Even rain seemed to pause against the windows. General Cade stepped beside Martin Hale, his voice lower now, stripped of ceremony. "Sir, this was authorized in 1986 and misrouted during a records transfer. It should have reached you decades ago." Martin frowned faintly, more puzzled than intrigued. He had lived too long to expect forgotten honors to matter. Mercer broke the seal and began to read. By order of the Department of the Army, Sergeant First Class Martin Hale is hereby recognized for actions beyond the scope of his original citation and designated honorary keeper of the line, a distinction conferred only upon personnel whose actions preserved command continuity under catastrophic conditions. Ethan Cole had never heard the title. From the look on even the military police at the doorway, neither had many of them. But General Cade's posture changed almost imperceptibly, as though in the presence of something sacred. Martin stared ahead, eyes narrowing, trying to place a memory buried under 40 years. Then Mercer read a final paragraph handwritten rather than typed. This recognition is not for heroism alone, but for the decision, under impossible pressure, to remain when retreat would have been understood. The words seemed to pass through Martin rather than toward him. In his mind, another fragment returned. Not helicopters now, but a ridgeline under cold dawn, a radio gone silent, younger men looking to him after officers had fallen. A choice made without witness. A line held because leaving had never occurred to him. Back in the courtroom, he drew one slow breath. I thought that report was lost. Cade almost smiled. Some things wait until they can be received properly. Judge Whitmore, still standing below his own bench, looked as though he had wandered into a history book and found himself judged by it. What does keeper of the line mean? He asked quietly. Mercer answered without looking up. In old Army tradition, it marks the one who held when collapse seemed certain. The phrase rolled through the room with the weight of legend. The veteran in the feed store cap whispered it under his breath as if tasting scripture. Then something even more unexpected happened. General Cade took from an aide a narrow velvet case. He opened it, revealing a small silver insignia shaped like cross standards. Not flashy, worn by almost no one. Sir, he said to Martin, with your permission, I would like to place this where it belongs. Martin looked almost uncomfortable. At my age, General, I have no need for decoration. Cade's reply came like a quiet creed. This is not decoration. This is memory made visible. He pinned the insignia beside the old medal with hands suddenly gentler than command would suggest. No applause followed. Only a silence so deep it felt lit from within. Ethan realized everyone present understood they were witnessing not reward but restoration. Outside, clouds were breaking. A blade of afternoon sunlight cut through rain and struck the blue ribbon on Martin's chest, making it flash once like signal fire. Then the courthouse clerk, voice trembling, rose and said she would like the corrected record entered permanently into county archives. One by one others voiced agreement. Even the judge ordered the full proceeding preserved. But as Mercer refolded the file, Ethan noticed a second envelope tucked beneath it marked Arlington. General Cade saw him notice and said very softly, "There is one more duty we owe him before this day ends." And suddenly the courtroom felt less like an ending than the threshold of something larger still. General Cade accepted the Arlington envelope from Colonel Mercer with a care normally reserved for folded flags. The cream paper was brittle at the edges, its seal embossed with an eagle worn soft by time. Martin Hale studied it with puzzled eyes. "I do not remember signing anything for Arlington," he said. Cade gave the faintest nod. "You did not, sir. This was prepared for you." A hush settled again as Mercer opened the envelope and withdrew a single parchment page. Ethan Cole noticed even Judge Whitmore had stepped closer now, no longer judge or adversary, only witness. Mercer read, "By authority of the Department of Defense, Sergeant First Class Martin Hale was designated years ago for honorary burial honors at Arlington National Cemetery, including a ceremonial riderless escort and full military remembrance, to be rendered upon his passing." The words seemed almost too large for the room. Martin blinked once, as if the sentence had crossed too many decades to be trusted. "That cannot be right," he murmured. "There are generals who have not received such arrangements." "That is correct," Cade said, "which is why it was not granted lightly." The old veteran looked down at the new insignia pinned beside the blue ribbon and gave a dry half-smile. "Interesting way to find out." Soft laughter moved through the room again, but reverence remained. Then Cade did something unexpected. He turned toward the courtroom doors and gave a slight signal. At once the honor guard outside stepped in, 6 soldiers in ceremonial dress, white gloves bright under courthouse lights. Their entrance carried no theatrical flourish, only measured dignity. Boots touched marble in perfect cadence. They formed 2 lines along the aisle where defendants normally walked alone. Ethan felt a chill rise along his arms. This was no longer response. It was tribute. Judge Whitmore whispered, almost to himself, "In this courtroom." Unable to finish, Cade answered without looking back. "Today it is a place of honor." Martin Hale slowly rose with the bailiff's help. Though once upright, he stood straighter than anyone expected, shoulders remembering old discipline. The silver insignia caught the beam of afternoon sun, still angling through rain-streaked windows. Cade stepped beside him. "Sir, before we escort you out, there is one request from active command." Martin raised an eyebrow. "At my age, requests from command sound suspicious." A few smiles flickered. Cade's voice softened. "Would you allow the guard to render honors now, while you can receive them?" For a long second Martin said nothing. The room seemed to lean toward his answer. Then he gave one slow nod. The command rang out. 6 right hands rose in salute. Even the military police at the door snapped to attention. Without prompting, Judge Whitmore straightened and did the same. Then, to Ethan's astonishment, people in the gallery stood one by one, not saluting but standing in instinctive respect. The old veteran in the feed store cap removed his hat and pressed it to his chest. No music played. No speeches interrupted. Only silence, thick and luminous, broken by the soft hum of courthouse lights and rain dripping from eaves outside. Martin returned the salute, his weathered hand steady. In that moment he looked less like a defendant exonerated than a standard returned to its post. When the honor guard lowered arms, Mercer leaned toward Cade and whispered something. The general's expression changed, almost boyish with disbelief. He turned to Martin. "Sir, there is a helicopter inbound from Fort Adams." Martin stared. "For me?" Cade nodded. "For a final stop before home." And as distant rotor thrum began faint beyond the courthouse walls, Ethan realized the day was still climbing toward a revelation none of them had imagined when a judge had mocked a medal only hours before. The rotor sound grew from distant rumor into unmistakable thunder, low and rhythmic, rolling over the courthouse roof until even those in the gallery turned instinctively toward the windows. General Cade glanced upward and almost smiled. Right on time. Outside, rain had broken into drifting mist, and through the tall panes Ethan Cole caught the dark shape descending toward the courthouse square, rotor wash sending wet leaves skittering across stone. It was not a transport anyone expected for a retired sergeant. A black UH-60 settled beyond the steps with deliberate grace, its silhouette cutting through silver light. Martin Hale stared at the window, disbelief finally cracking his weathered calm. "That cannot be for me," Cade answered. "It has been waiting a long time, sir." The honor guard shifted formation and opened a path toward the aisle. No defendant had ever left courtroom 3 through a corridor of salutes. Yet Martin walked it now, slowly but unbowed, with General Cade at his side and Judge Whitmore stepping back to clear the way. As they reached the doorway, the judge spoke, voice stripped of all ceremony. "Mr. Hale." Martin turned. Whitmore held out the gavel he had wielded hours before. Not as surrender but offering. "I have presided in this room for 18 years, he said. "And today I learned authority without humility is only noise." Martin regarded him a long second, then rested 2 fingers briefly on the gavel. "Then today served us both." It was forgiveness without performance. Ethan felt the words settle deeper than the apology before. Outside, the courthouse steps gleamed with rain. The honor guard descended first, boots crisp against wet granite. People had gathered along the sidewalks now, drawn by the helicopter and convoy, unaware of the full story yet sensing history passing near. Some removed hats, some lifted phones, then lowered them as if recording would profane the moment. The feed store veteran from the gallery stood under the awning with hand over heart. Rotor wash tugged at coats and stirred the blue ribbon on Martin's chest. As he approached the aircraft, The crew chief at the open door came rigidly to attention. Then, astonishing even Cade, he spoke a call sign into his headset. "Keeper of the line boarding." The phrase crackled over aviation radio and seemed to ripple through everyone within earshot. Martin halted. His eyes narrowed against spinning wind. The sound carried him somewhere far older. For one suspended heartbeat, the courthouse vanished, and he was young again beside a battered helicopter on foreign soil, hearing wounded men cheer because somehow they were going home. The memory passed with the rotor gust. He stepped forward. But before boarding, General Cade gestured toward the helicopter's nose. Painted beneath the cockpit in subdued stencil were two words Martin had not seen in decades. Iron Shepherd, the field nickname his platoon once gave him. His breath caught. "Who authorized this?" Cade answered softly, almost proud. "The pilots requested it." Ethan stood rooted on the courthouse steps, watching institutions. He thought he understood bend around one quiet old man. Martin touched the aircraft's skin with weathered fingers as if greeting an old comrade. Then he climbed aboard. Cade followed. The door remained open one moment longer as Mercer hurried up the steps carrying a small folded map tube. He handed it to Martin and whispered, "One final destination before home." Martin opened it halfway, saw Arlington marked in red pencil beside a memorial circle bearing his unit insignia, and looked up stunned. The helicopter lifted in a storm of mist and sound, banking toward the river as those below watched in silence. But as Ethan tracked it vanishing into pale afternoon, he realized the final revelation was not the flight itself. It was where they were taking Martin Hale before the sun went down. The helicopter followed the river north in a long arc of late afternoon light, the city falling away beneath them until government buildings became pale geometry against the green. Martin Hale sat beside the open headset, hands folded over the blue ribbon and silver insignia, saying little. General Cade did not press conversation. Some silences deserve protection. Below, the broad grounds of Arlington appeared, ordered rows flowing over hills like white lines drawn with impossible patience. When the aircraft settled near a quiet memorial grove away from visitors, rotor wash stirred grass and small American flags planted beside older stones. Martin stepped down slowly, looking not like a man arriving for ceremony but one returning to an unfinished promise. At the center of the grove stood a granite marker unlike the others, newly prepared, bearing not a burial date but a unit crest carved above a simple inscription, "To those who held the line." Martin stopped as though struck by memory. "My platoon," he whispered. Mercer nodded. "The ones who did not come home." General Cade motioned toward a semicircle of waiting figures in dress uniforms. But among them stood something Martin did not expect. 3 old men, each stooped by age, each wearing veterans' caps from different wars. Surviving members of the unit he had believed long gone. One stepped forward with a cane and a grin weathered by decades. "Took you long enough, Shepherd." Martin stared, then laughed softly in disbelief, the sound almost boyish. It was the first unguarded joy Ethan Cole had ever seen in him, and Ethan, who had been flown separately at Cade's invitation, understood why he had been brought. Not to witness power reversal but restoration. There were no grand speeches. Only names spoken aloud one by one at the memorial, each followed by a pause in the wind. General Cade placed a wreath. Martin touched the stone with fingertips that trembled only then. At sunset, the honor guard rendered final honors, not funeral honors, but honors for the living. As the bugle notes drifted over the hillside, even birds seemed to hold still. Judge Whitmore, who had driven from the courthouse uninvited and stood respectfully at the edge of the gathering, removed his robe before approaching Martin afterward. "I came to learn how to remember better," he said. Martin looked at him with that old Winterwater calm. "Then remember this," he said. "Respect should arrive before recognition." Whitmore lowered his head, receiving it almost as instruction. When the ceremony ended and long shadows stretched over marble rows, Martin declined the motorcade home. "I would like to walk a minute," he said. Cade let him. Ethan watched the old veteran move slowly among the markers, touching none, yet belonging among all. Finally Martin turned back and looked toward the young prosecutor. You made a call when it mattered. Ethan shook his head. I only noticed what should have been obvious. Martin smiled faintly. That is how justice often begins. Darkness gathered soft and blue. The helicopter waited, rotors still. Before boarding, General Cade asked quietly if Martin wished Arlington honors revised with today's additions. Martin considered and said, "Leave it simple." He looked once more over the white rose. The men beside me earned the grandeur. Then he stepped aboard. As the aircraft lifted into evening, Ethan remained on the hill beside Judge Whitmore, both watching navigation lights fade into the dark. Hours earlier, a courtroom had nearly reduced a medal to decoration. Now a nation, in one quiet day, had corrected itself. And long after the rotor sound vanished, Ethan would remember Martin Hale's final words more than the salutes or stars. Honor does not ask to be seen. It only asks not to be forgotten.